So yeah, as many of you have probably heard, earlier this year, the platypus were officially listed as vulnerable in Victoria. The first state to actually have them on their threatened species list. They are actually listed in South Australia, but populations were never all that extensive through there anyway. So really the first state that's had a very widespread population that's listed platypus as vulnerable. And I guess there was a lot of media that went around, a lot of attention earlier this year, and I did see a lot of commentary around it, some true and some not, a lot of questions on social media. So I thought this was a good chance to just kind of talk a little bit about the listing. A lot of the data that backs up that listing was based on our research that we've done over the last, I think it's about 13 years now, and a little bit through the process of how it came about. So I should say that on top of that listing, there's also a push to actually have platypus listed nationally with a number of groups across Australia. So more to come in this space. So to have a species listed as vulnerable or threatened, there's criteria that have to be met. And on the international scale, so the IUCN, there's lots of sort of subtleties around it, but basically what you have to demonstrate is that there's been at least a 30% decline in populations over a period of 3 generations. So for platypuses, we're talking around that 30-year period. So declines before that are kind of irrelevant, even though we know they've occurred. It's only what's happened in the last 30 years that really contributes to that listing. And this can be a decline in both abundance, it can be in distribution, it can be in area of occupancy. There's different metrics that can be used. And I think what's really important is that declines are continuing and they're going to continue in the future. So that's really relevant for platypus when we think about some of the threats that they face. So why did we actually want them to be listed? So just to give you a bit of an overview, this is the distribution of platypuses across Australia. These red dots are the entire records of platypus that we have on our main wildlife database, so the Atlas of Living Australia. So looks like there's quite a lot there. There's about 11,000 records, but we consider the scale. Australia's a pretty big place and these sightings span 100 years. It's actually incredibly sparse data. And this has been one of the big barriers in being able to assess platypuses, is that we just don't have good historical data. We basically have some presence absence in limited areas, but we don't have good historical data to be able to quantify declines. And that's one of the big challenges that we've faced. So if we drill into Victoria, you can already see that those records suddenly become a bit sparse once you look at a larger scale. So these are all the records across Victoria over 100 years. This is in the 30 years, so that sort of period that we're looking at. Still very widespread. There's been a few absences in some areas. And then in the last 10 years, which is a bit of a concern. So even though these time periods are getting smaller, there's certainly some patterns that are forming there. But unfortunately, this is very much anecdotal data. So it's just kind of random sightings that people see or captures during other surveys. There's no sort of systematic data that's being collected over that scale. So I guess the question for myself and other ecologists is, are these declines that we're seeing in this data real, or is it just an anomaly? Absence of sightings doesn't necessarily mean absence of platypuses. So that's really what we were trying to address. The other reason for concern is that platypus are completely dependent on aquatic ecosystems. These are some of the most threatened and degraded ecosystems in the world. Some of the major threats, I'm not going to go into them in detail today, but for platypus, it's things like drought, water abstraction or diversion from our rivers, clearing of surrounding catchments, invasive species like willows, cattle access or stock access in general, water quality, introduced predators, litter entanglement, which is really relevant in the urban areas, and also drowning in fishing equipment. So all of these things we know are threats to platypuses. I guess the challenge is how much of a threat are they, and are they having a significant impact? So I think it's not hard to imagine that these populations are under a lot of stress. The big challenge is how do we collect that data to be able to show that empirically. So we have had some very long-running partnerships with a number of organisations, in particular Melbourne Water, who's had a platypus monitoring program for 25 years now. This has been largely based on live trapping, but so this is the Melbourne area. These are the 5 major river catchments, along with our major waterways through here. And these blue lines represent what I've been able to piece together of historical platypus distribution. So they pretty much would have occupied most of the permanent waterways throughout the Melbourne region. Now, this trapping program, like I said, it's been running for 25 years. These yellow markers here represent ones that we've got relatively good data for over that period. And it's quite variable. So platypus trapping is inherently quite variable in the results. So you can see in this, this is a time series of our capture rates over time at one of our locations. Incredibly variable, so one-off surveys don't tell you a great deal. You certainly need that replication to be able to give you a good picture of what's going on. This is an area where we've had very limited change over time. It's been pretty consistent. Unfortunately, in other areas, we've seen, why is that not coming up? So in other areas like this, we've actually seen localized extinctions. But what most of our areas look like, something like this. So we've seen declines over the period, and this also coincides with the millennium drought. And then since that drought finished, that decline hasn't actually continued. It's either plateaued out or in fact increased a little bit. So we're starting to see a little bit of population recovery since the drought, but certainly not back to pre-drought levels. And that's what most of our study sites look like. On top of that, more recently, we've been able to implement eDNA surveys. If you're not aware, basically we can go take a water sample, look for platypus DNA, and with very high accuracy say whether platypus are there or not. We did a very widespread survey across Melbourne a couple of years ago, basically mapped platypus distribution throughout the area. All of these markers represent our sample sites, and green is where platypus were found. And you can see some very clear patterns there. So in these sort of forested areas, you get very high site occupancy. And in these more agricultural urban areas, there's a lot of white dots, so low site occupancy. And typically where we've got sparse populations, we might get an occupancy level of between 10 and 30%, whereas in these healthy populations, it's over 80%. And this correlates exactly with our trapping data. So our high abundance from our trapping correlates with high site occupancy, and where populations are really struggling, it's low site occupancy, there's low reproduction. So there's lots of metrics that we get from our trapping. The eDNA data complements it, but also expands it over a much greater area. So we can take all that data and look at the current situation of platypuses in Melbourne, and it looks a bit more like this. So this is not just a distribution map. I've also sort of done a rough conservation status of these different populations. So green is where we've got healthy populations, correlates with high abundance, high reproductive output, high site occupancy with our eDNA, and red is where populations are really struggling. And you can probably see from this map, the red populations tend to be smaller, localized, isolated populations. And this is an issue of fragmentation that wildlife populations across the globe face. It's a major conservation issue. Basically, these isolated populations under much greater stress, much greater threat of extinction. And as Peter will mention later on, they also have issues in terms of genetic problems, loss of genetic diversity, inbreeding, loss of adaptive potential. So lots of issues with these isolated populations. So probably not surprisingly, populations across Melbourne are under a lot of stress to varying degrees. Another area where we've got pretty good data is the Wimmera catchment in Western Victoria. So this is the Wimmera River running through that terminates in a Hindmarsh Lake. Top of the Grampians here, just to sort of put you on the map. Where these orange dots, again, this is the grand total of platypus records on our wildlife databases. These span about 50 to 60 years since about the 60s and 70s. Not many records across an entire catchment. In 2008, at the end of the drought, when the Wimmera River basically dried up completely, at least the upper reaches, we did some widespread trapping surveys. So all these dots represent where we did trapping surveys throughout the area. This is what we were able to find. We had one platypus in the upper Mackenzie River. Rest of the catchment, there was no evidence of platypus occurring. And again, we predicted about a 1% surface water availability through this upper region. So when the rivers dry up, there's nowhere for platypus to live. It's not rocket science, but it was important to get that data. Since then, we verified it with more trapping surveys, but also eDNA. So we know that platypus have certainly declined or disappeared from the rest of the catchment. This little population we've been monitoring very closely with Wimmera CMA. It's still hanging on, it's still persisting. It is expanding, it's growing very slowly. It's increasing in its size and its distribution. And importantly, we've seen reproduction in about the last 5 or 6 years, which we hadn't seen for a decade before that. So, but still a very isolated, very threatened population, and the only population that exists in that entire catchment. Some of our other more localised areas, so this is the upper Barwon region. We've got Winchelsea here, and this is the Otway Ranges. Orange dots, again, represent our historical data. This was a citizen science project we ran with the local Landcare group using eDNA. Went and sampled about 40 sites throughout the area. Green is where we found platypus again, and white is where we didn't. Still pretty widespread throughout that area, but because we've got such limited historical data, it's almost impossible to quantify declines, even though it looks like there's probably been some declines through this middle Barwon region where flow regimes are pretty poor and habitat quality is pretty poor, but it's just impossible. We don't have that empirical data to quantify those declines. What we can say is that the current status of that population isn't great. It's fairly moderate site occupancy. There's about 40% site occupancy in this area. As you remember, our healthy populations had sort of 80% plus occupancy. So a population that's under a bit of stress through there. Similar project we ran in the upper Campaspe region. So this is the Campaspe River here, Coliban River through here. These orange X's are our historical data, and all these markers are where we did our eDNA sampling. Our results were a little bit depressing. We basically couldn't find platypuses throughout we had one positive site in the Campaspe River. We've had a few sporadic sightings there, so we know they're there in very low numbers, but they're, virtually disappeared from that entire system. Little bit better news in the Coliban. It was about a 50% occupancy, but again, we're seeing some pretty major issues through these highly modified agricultural landscapes. So if we sort of look at all that together, this is our, obviously, map of Victoria and our subcatchments here that we've got, our major river subcatchments. So we know that platypus disappeared from the lower Murray back in the sort of 50s and 60s. We've now got really good data in the Melbourne region where we've got some catchments where they've either disappeared completely or almost disappeared. And again, through that sort of Wimmera region, we know there's some major issues. We're recently able to confirm that they've gone from the Curtis system just near the Otways here, and also the Bass. So these are areas that we've got really good data where platypus populations have either disappeared completely or they're on the verge. They're very low numbers. And we've got other catchments where we know there's some pretty major issues like the Barwon and Campaspe and some of our Melbourne catchments. And then we do have a few areas where we know populations are doing okay. But this is basically the grand total of data that we've got across Victoria. So what we've had to do when we're looking at a Victoria-wide assessment of their conservation status is you can extrapolate that data. So I should say that all these other subcatchments, it's not that populations are doing well, it's just that we don't have good data there. And you can probably make predictions that, through these eastern Victoria and our sort of forested, undisturbed areas, populations are probably doing quite well. But as we've seen from the catchments in our western region where it's drier, a lot more agricultural, a lot less native vegetation remaining, populations are probably under quite a lot of stress. Maybe not to the extent that we're seeing in the Wimmera, but there's almost certainly been declines through those areas. The other thing, unfortunately, when we're talking about healthy populations in eastern Victoria, of course, a lot of that area was recently burnt, and we're actually able to look at that impact of those fires just recently. These results came out late last year. We were lucky enough to have some pre-fire data, went back and surveyed those sites after the fire. And even though we still found platypus were reasonably widespread, we did see an impact. So our control sites had virtually no change over time, but our fire impact sites, it was about 15% decline in site occupancy. So when you put all that together, things aren't looking great across Victoria. So I guess the process to get them listed, we had to sort of summarise that data, and I should call out a friend of mine, conservation photographer called Doug Gimmishy, who really drove this. Based on a lot of our data, we had to sort of put that application together for the FFG. It goes off to the Scientific Advisory Committee, who review it. They send it out to a number of independent experts, so both platypus ecologists, which are few and far between, but other aquatic ecologists, researchers from university. They review the application, decide whether it's makes sense, whether the data is there to say that it should be listed. That then goes back to the advisory committee, who makes a preliminary recommendation to say, yes, look, we think platypus should be listed in Victoria. It goes out for public comment. The scientific advisory committee again looks at those public comments. Is there anything that's going to change their recommendation? In this instance, there wasn't any. I should say overwhelmingly we had support from both the experts and public in this case, apart from one group that was a little bit frustrating. The final recommendation by the advisory committee was that yes, platypus should be listed in Victoria. That goes to the minister, who has the final say, and as we saw earlier this year, she listed the platypus as vulnerable in Victoria. Now, I should say this was very much a bittersweet moment. We think it's a very important step in their conservation, but it is a bit sad that populations are declining. And just finally, what we are trying to do now is fill in these gaps. So large areas of Victoria where we need to understand more about populations, where we can direct our management actions. Something called the Great Victorian Platypus Search in partnership with Odonata. There's a website you can go to get more information and to get involved. It will very much be a citizen science-based project to collect water samples and analyse for platypus DNA. And just finally, I must acknowledge a number of organisations that we've worked with over the years, in particular Melbourne Water and Wimmera CMA, who we've had a very long-term relationship with. So thank you all, and I'll look forward to questions at the end.